This installment of the Federal Bureaucracy screencast is going to talk and focus on some of the benefits and the negatives of the bureaucracy. So first of all, some of the positives of bureaucracy is that they are the implementation and enforcement element of the law. So when you take a look at all of the legislation that is passed, obviously there are going to have to be people who implement and make sure that that law is being followed. The people are also able to know about or be able to get into the nitty-gritty of different rules and regulations through the bureaucracy. So if you're someone who is creating a transportation company, we've got a lot of people here in the state of Iowa who are independent truckers, and there are a lot of rules and regulations about that. So there's different bureaus, there's different agencies, there are different places they can go. They also, if you are supposed to be receiving benefits, you don't have to go to Washington, D.C. if you need to make an appointment at the Social Security office. There are offices all throughout the country and in every single state. And then again, making sure that people are being protected. So we have a lot of regulations that have come into play, especially workers' rights issues or regulations involving accessibility to public businesses and public places. And so we have bureaucracy that helps to implement that. We also have some negatives of the bureaucracy, and one of the things is standard operating procedures, or SOPs, is often affiliated with some of the negatives, and they in and of themselves are not necessarily supposed to be negative. It's supposed to be a system of procedures to help different agencies and people within the agencies to be consistent making their decisions, so a way to be efficient and a way to get things done. But because things have grown and it's very complicated within the bureaucracy, this can actually create a lot of red tape because there are certain hoops or certain forms, certain people, certain lines that standard operating procedures force you to do step by step. And it can sometimes make no sense because instead of replacing an operating procedure, they just add on an operating procedure when a problem arises. So it can create kind of an infinite loop of tasks to do before you can actually get the help that you need or the answers that you need. So all of that is often referred to collectively as red tape, and red tape is seen as a very negative thing. So this can happen, again, with some pointless hoops that you have to jump through just to get access to information or answers to your questions. It can also make it hard for people who are trying to implement the law or help you out actually just to cut to the chase and be able to make the decision they know will be made, but they have to go through all of these procedures first. So it's frustrating for them. And it can also be something that is an excessive regulation. So, something that has been over-managed and over-regulated to the point that it just creates a lot of unnecessary hampering to either the creation or the completion of business or helping out the public. So again, this confuses people. It's annoying to people. It's often the reason that people get very frustrated and upset, especially within some of the Social Security and social services related parts of the bureaucracy, because that's what most Americans eventually deal with. It can also be confusing, especially when old regulations aren't removed. And so it can create a lot of confusion as to what exactly you're supposed to do. Especially as maybe new things crop up that haven't been, part of a question or part of a system in the past. And then it also stops people from getting the benefits that they need. So, some examples of some of this is if there's a problem, if there's an issue with, getting into a veterans hospital, for example, because of all of the red tape, it could be weeks, it could be months before people are able to get things figured out. And if you're sick, if there's something really wrong, weeks and months matter. So it can be very frustrating. Again, red tape is not the only thing that can slow down the process. Sometimes the legislation is problematic. So we can have problems with the law. Believe it or not, Congress is not made up of end-all, be-all experts of all of the different pieces of legislation that they are enacting. Frequently, we have congressmen and women who pass laws who have not read those laws. They do depend on experts, and that's where we talk about with the interest groups and the people that have become pretty powerful that way. They're providing a lot of the research because they understand that's a big hole for the congressmen and women, even though they are very smart people. And so then you can end up with a law that it doesn't really make much sense in practical application. And so then it can be problematic for a bureaucracy to try to implement it. A good example of this is the No Child Left Behind Act, Nickleby, and we'll talk more about this. The act in and of itself, the idea behind the act of making sure that all children succeed and have access to education and have kind of fail-safes to help them be successful in education, totally made sense, and people were on board with that. But the measures that they were using for yearly growth were definitely problematic, and if schools didn't meet that yearly growth, they could be put on these lists. Well, if you were someone who was, as a student, who was already performing, in the 90th, 95th, 98th percentile, there really isn't a lot of room for you to grow, and you are already very successful. But if you didn't meet that minimum year's growth, then you were actually shown as not meeting the standard. And therefore schools, there were a lot of high performing schools that were falling short of the standard of the law. So that can be a problem. Lack of clarity. So believe it or not, when you have hundreds to maybe 1,000 pages of legislation, there can be some confusion as to what exactly you're supposed to be doing. Lack of resources. So I know it's hard to believe, but sometimes there isn't actually money or appropriations attached to legislation. So it's just expected to be carried out. We call that an unfunded mandate. And so you have legislation that's put in place, for example, new regulations for the environment, but there's no more money that is given to the EPA. And so the EPA has to do more work with the same resources, and therefore you end up with someone who is pretty much overworked. And then fragmentation, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize within the bureaucracy, but the implementation of policy basically never happens unilaterally within one single bureaucratic arm. It can maybe happen within a single department, but you are going to see multiple agencies, multiple bureaus, multiple offices who have some kind of skin in the game in terms of having to implement this. And so they have to try and talk, and they have to try to figure out how to work together to implement this. And again, when you're already super busy or super scheduled or really lacking in resources, that communication can get next to impossible to ascertain. And so you end up with a lot of pieces of the puzzle that are being carried out, and you just kind of hope people are doing what they need to be doing. But then if you guys have ever done puzzles, you notice that you end up with pieces that go missing. You don't know why, but it makes the whole puzzle kind of hard to complete. So a good example of this fragmentation is the border wall. So taking a look at something that's happening right now, and you see that the different bureaucracies that are involved in building a border wall would be the Army Corps of Engineers, Homeland Security, so the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Naturalization Services, the Drug Enforcement Administration as part of this process, the Federal Bureau of Investigation as part of this process, as well as the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. So we're taking a look. We've got Department of Defense, we've got Department of Homeland Security, we've got the Department of Justice happening here. So big cabinet departments and multiple agencies every time there is something having to do with border, especially construction of border walls, border issues. And that is the end of this particular screencast.